How's everybody doing this morning? Y'all doing all right? Good deal. Well, we kicked off Festivals Accordions at Creole last night with the Bourrée tournament at Warehouse 535 and wound up with 3 winners who will be at the main stage tomorrow to accept their awards. We had the Cajun Jam at the Blue Moon, and then here we are today for the Crafting South Louisiana Sound, Tools of Cajun and Creole Music, which is in conjunction with the exhibit that is going on at A. Hayes Townhouse that you can also go and see, that was curated by Chris Segura, who I think is here. Huh, Chris? There's Chris over there. Give Chris a round of applause. As well as Miss Anya Burgess, who is probably opening up her shop solo violins about right now. But I want to just go ahead and thank all the people that helped put this thing on. It takes quite a few sponsors and financial support, to put on this event, and especially these events, symposiums and whatnot, the exhibit. And I want to thank, it's presented by Lafayette Utility Systems. So let's give them a round of applause. They've come on big time. We also want to thank the Center for Louisiana Studies and their support. Jennifer Ritter Guidry has worked real hard in putting this together. Let's give her a round of applause. And we also want to thank LUS Fiber, the Haney Family Foundation, who also played an instrumental role in putting on the exhibit at the A. Hayes Townhouse. And again, you'll be able to see that this weekend at the festival. Let's give them a round of applause. Along with the Paul and Lulu Hilliard University Art Museum. And we also want to thank David Sheremy with Vermilionville for allowing us to have the symposium here. So let's give David a round of applause in Vermilionville. And I think there'll be a lunch buffet available at lunch, so you don't even have to leave the building. You can sit here and eat and enjoy yourself. So I want to turn it over to my cohort in crime and the founding member of Festivals Accordions at Creole. We're celebrating our 43rd anniversary this year. It's hard to believe it's been that long. He started when he was like 6 years old, I believe. It's amazing. I don't know how he was such a capable. He's just jealous. Everybody's just jealous of my legs. Okay, let's just get serious about this for a second. Okay, you know, I can pull this off. Most people can't. Don't pull them off. Don't pull them off. I didn't say pull them. Oh, I'm not going to pull them up. But don't tempt me, okay? Because you know I'm a little crazy, okay? I've been known to be a little crazy. Anyway, enough of that. Dr. Barry Onsele.
So, yeah, seriously. This is, that was Pat Mole, by the way. Pat would never say this himself, but he has been instrumental in making this festival financially stable, and we really owe him a great debt of gratitude for that. This symposium is the sort of an outgrowth of the exhibition that we put together, the exhibit at the Hayes Townhouse, as Pat said. And this second look at instrument making in South Louisiana is sort of a continuation of something we first did in, what was it, 85? Is that right? 84. 1984. Just got this idea that you noticed that there were a lot of people making these amazing instruments in South Louisiana, and we did an exhibition at the time entitled Travailler c'est trop dur, the tools of Cajun music. And all these years later, there were so many things that happened, and things kept evolving, that it seemed interesting to take another look at this. And when we got this idea to focus on instrument making, immediately talked to Chris and Anya and asked them if they would be interested, and they I was fishing, and they both said yes. And I tell you what, they took off and have put together the most amazing collection of instruments, both historical and contemporary, improvised and quite professional, showing the range of work that's being done in South Louisiana, from accordions to violins to to steel guitars. Have any of you seen the exhibition yet? Isn't it amazing? I mean, one of my favorite pieces is the 2x4 steel guitar that Milton Gilbo made some time ago. Yeah, and the one-string fiddle with a tobacco tin resonating box that Milton Vanacore made. Everything from those kinds of things to absolutely world-class instruments that could be sent and played anywhere. The best diatonic accordions in the world today are made in South Louisiana, and some amazing violins and guitars, and they've expanded the consideration to percussion instruments and also amplifiers and electrical instruments. So I highly recommend that you go and take a look at that. This symposium is going to discuss the process, but don't miss the stuff. They really did a great job. Thank you all for doing that. I tell you, it's such an amazing experience to be able to hand the ball off to these amazingly talented and energetic kids, sorry, it's a perspective thing. And see them just run for touchdown like this. It's really I'm so gratified. So this symposium is going to take a look at the process, and it's going to give you an opportunity to hear up close some of the people who are involved in making, not only making, but inventing these things. For example, the diatonic accordion was literally reinvented in South Louisiana, and that process is absolutely fascinating. And I think we're going to have Randy Falcon's going to be here. He continued the invention process even beyond what Marc Savoie had laid out to build on that. And I think that's wonderfully characteristic of what has happened here. There's an amazing spirit of social cooperation. In one way they're competitors, but in another way they all have cooperated. They all share information. They all share techniques. They even share pieces. And it's a really great example of how this culture works at its best when everybody's working together and sharing things in a spirit of social cooperation. So you're going to see some really amazing things and hear about some really amazing processes. And I welcome you to this symposium. And again, please visit the exhibition at the Hayes Townhouse, and I'll see you also at the festival. And now, Michael Martin, the Director of the Center for Louisiana Studies, will also
Thank you, Barry and Pat. So I just have a few words of thanks as well. And then I'd like to share just a thought on what we've been seeing at the exhibit at the Art Museum and what we will be seeing today at this symposium. First and foremost, we want to thank Festivals Acadiens et Creole for partnering with us once again. This is now the fourth year that there has been a symposium of this sort. The last 3 years, we have been vitally involved in planning and producing these symposiums. And so we're very proud to partner with Festival, and we are glad to continue our partnership. For those who don't know, the Center for Louisiana Studies is located on UL's campus. We have a bunch of different divisions. We house the UL Press. We have a research and archives division that includes the largest archive of Cajun and Creole folklore in the world. And then we do programming such as this. We also, in conjunction with Festival, record every single moment of every single performance. those recordings go into our archives, and we've been happy and pleased to grow our archives in that way, and also on occasion produce commercial releases from those recordings. So it's a great partnership that we have with Festivals Acadiens. We're glad to see it continue, and we know it will continue well into the future. I'd like to thank my center staff members who have either been involved in the exhibit or today's symposia, or both. For today in particular, we need to thank, and I know Pat already mentioned her, Jennifer Ritter-Guidry, who has coordinated today's activities and events. I'm grateful for her and her hard work at the center, and it really shows the diligence and talent she has when we get to do something like this. John Pud Sharp has also been involved in these sort of things. You can see him back there cheering for himself. If you know Pud, you know that's not out of character. And of course, Chris Segura, sitting over here, who, along with Anya Burgess, was really at the heart of putting together the exhibit that is now at the Hilliard Museum's A. Hayes Town building. I don't know if it was mentioned before, but we need to thank AOC Community Media. They're here filming for posterity. So this will be available for viewers through their platforms. And we of course will have make it available through the Archive of Cajun and Creole Folklore as well. Just as a reminder, you only have until Sunday to see the exhibit. I know there's going to be a lot going on between now and then, but make time to work your way over to the A. Hayes Town building and check that exhibit out. Now, I just wanted to say a little bit about some of the things that Barry has already touched upon, but what we'll be talking about throughout the day. And I was considering this sort of homemade, handmade tradition of musical instrument making in South Louisiana. I think this tradition exists elsewhere, of course, but we're here and we know that we have a special tradition in South Louisiana. It's remarkable the kind of craftsmanship and the kind of artistry that we see when we go to one of these exhibits, but also when we see people playing these instruments. And I think that craftsmanship and artistry of the musicians and the musical instrument makers are about on a level playing field. That the people who make the instruments are just as much the artists, just as much the craftsmen as the people who play the instruments. And I think that's very important because you can see, especially as you kind of study this, the development of relationships between particular instrument builders and particular artists. There are certain people who really want to play a certain person's violin, a certain person's guitar, a certain person's accordion, right? And in both segments of that, the musicians and the makers, you have people of the highest caliber who are engaged in this kind of mutually beneficial process. The other thing that I was thinking about is, I think it's tempting for us to say what makes these instrument makers that we'll be talking to today and we'll be learning about today, what makes them so remarkable, what makes them seem so talented, is that they have a skill that has, for the most part, been lost. In the same way that most people can't frame up a wall in a house these days, many people can't change the oil in their car these days, the talent of building these instruments has been lost somewhere in the past. And while it is tempting to say that, and while I somewhat agree with that the numbers have shrunk of people who can actually engage in this activity, I also would argue that even if we were to take these instrument makers and place them back at a time in history when there were more people who could do it, they would still be recognized as masters of their craft. These are people who are truly talented individuals, who are inventive, who have the highest caliber of skills. And it doesn't matter if it's 2017, or if it's 1910, or if it's 1850, or if it's 1700, they would be recognized the same way, in my opinion. And I say that as an historian, I say that as an aficionado of Cajun and Creole and French music, and I say that as someone who thinks that this is very much true. So thank you for being here. We're glad that we have such a nice crowd. We've almost filled all the tables up. At this point, what I'm going to do is head into an introduction of today's first speaker. Our keynote address today is being given by Dr. Mark DeWitt. Dr. DeWitt is the Tommy Como Endowed Chair of Traditional Music at UL Lafayette, where he has taught and overseen the undergraduate degree program in traditional music since 2010. He is a recent addition to the company of fellows of the Center for Louisiana Studies, which is a very select group of people who do research and teaching and other things in Louisiana Studies, so we're very happy to welcome him to that. Dr. DeWitt received his PhD in ethnomusicology from the University of California at Berkeley. He also holds a Master in Music Theory from the New England Conservatory of Music, and just to throw you off a little bit, a bachelor's degree in urban studies and planning from Massachusetts Institute of Technology. He is the author of Cajun and Zydeco Dance Music in North California, Modern Pleasures in a Postmodern World, which is an absolutely wonderful book. I strongly recommend it to every one of you. And he is the book review editor for Ethnomusicology, which is the main journal in his field of study. Today, Dr. DeWitt will be discussing expressions of human intelligence and creativity, musical instruments worldwide and here at home. Dr. DeWitt.
Thank you, Michael. Thank you to Michael and to Barry for inviting me to give this talk today. And I should say a couple words before I get started about the Dr. Tommy Como Endowed Chair in Traditional Music. If any of you came to something called a medicine show, a fundraiser, there were fundraisers that happened since between 1997 and 2011. You were helping to raise money for the programs that I now run. So I was hired to take that budget that was created by the endowment and to hire local musicians to come and teach students how to play traditional music, and that's what we do today. We have in 4 different ensembles. We started with a Cajun group, so we've got now 2 Cajun groups, a Zydeco group, bluegrass group, and a blues group. And the bluegrass and blues are playing a concert November 15th, and the Cajun and Zydeco groups are playing a concert at the Blue Moon Saloon, where you can dance on the Tuesday after Thanksgiving. So keep that in mind. So, and the mission of the chair is to do that, and also to promote research and education on traditional music, not just here but everywhere. So to kind of take a worldwide perspective on it. So that's kind of what I want to do with you today, is to take a step back and think about, yes, this is a special place, as Dr. Martin was just saying. There are a lot of great musicians here. There are a lot of great instrument makers here as we're learning from this exhibit. And I'm going to show some photos of some of the instruments from the exhibit in my presentation today. But it turns out there's lots of great musicians other places too, and lots of great instrument makers other places too, and the range of human creativity when it comes to musical instruments is really quite amazing, and it's something that's amazed me for a long time, and I've followed it for a long time. So in this presentation, I have a couple of books that I used a lot of images from, but then also whenever I go to museums in other cities, if they have a musical instrument room, I'm usually in there with my phone trying to get a few shots of here and there. So you'll see a few shots that I took from other museums along the way as well. So I do, just to give an overview of the whole talk, I'll just start by talking about the potential value of an outsider perspective to something that may be very familiar to most of you in terms of accordions and fiddles and triangles and rubboards and things like that. And then to talk about that whole idea of human ingenuity and how actually to have a classification system that may not be at first all that intuitive can actually help us appreciate all this creativity that's gone on in human history. And then at the end I'll talk a little bit about timbre and look at some actual pictures of musical sound that may be familiar to a few of you, but may be new to others of you, where we can actually talk about what might make T-fare actually sound like a T-fare and not like another kind of triangle. And I'll also be, at the end, I'll be presenting some ongoing work that a master's candidate in our School of Music, Jesse Del GC, is working on, and he's here today, so he can answer any questions at the end as well. And thanks to Jesse for helping me with the spectrograms. So, perspectives, where are we coming from here? I'm sort of coming from the perspective of cultural anthropology and ethnomusicology, which is my training. But one of the best kind of summations of what cultural anthropology to me seems to be about actually comes from T.S. Eliot talking about poetry, which is that the job of good poetry is to make the familiar strange and the strange familiar. You know, so when you think about it, that's true. So, you know, we were looking at other cultures. I find that when I'm teaching a class on music from other parts of the world that's not very familiar to people, it helps to have these kind of categories that they can relate to their everyday experience. It's like, okay, if this is a chordophone, this is a string instrument with strings, they have some instrument with strings too that's just kind of configured a little differently. Kind of the same general principles. Maybe the cultural meaning is different. The decorations are different. So I'm not going to be talking so much this presentation about musical instrument design in terms of, you know, what might be painted on it or what the symbolism is. I'm going to be talking more about the architecture of the instrument, like how does it make the sound, and what principles are involved, and also how, and just how is it shaped. And also, of course, with cultural anthropology, we expect to read as ethnography. I like to think of it as writing about people. Is kind of the definition of what ethnography really is to me. Some people also use it as a synonym for doing field work, but it really is about writing about people. And you know, some people have done this type of work with instrument makers too. Certainly, Dr. Onsley has, and this anthropologist at Yale recently wrote a book about guitar luthiers, and she had I took a little quote from her that I think is appropriate to the spirit of the exhibit that's on display right now. So instead of assuming that what we desire is the object in whose presence we feel desire, suppose what we long for is to be in a particular kind of relationship with things. So what made me think of this was we were talking about this exhibit in this earlier this year before it was on, and Barry said something about, you know, why would people make things here if they can just buy them? They can just order them in a mail order catalog. Why make a triangle if you can just buy a triangle? Well, maybe you don't have the money to buy one, or maybe you don't have access to the store. But also, before the age of the internet, you know, you just didn't have Amazon to buy it. But also, it was just kind of cool to make one. It was kind of it was satisfying. You get some gratification. You made that. You made that yourself, and it has a certain sound, and it doesn't sound like the other ones. So there's that personal relationship with the object that goes beyond, you know, just having something because I want a triangle or I want a guitar or a fiddle. So, and there, in anthropology and also in ethnomusicology, my field, there's this concept of, well, you know, there's certain kinds of things that if you've lived inside a culture your whole life, you understand and you know, and it may be difficult to explain to somebody else, but there's a lot that you know. And if somebody's coming in from outside and they spend a week with you like a journalist would, or a few days like at Mardi Gras, Barry's written very persuasively that that's not enough time to really understand what's going on. And a lot of times the journalists get it wrong. And anthropologists might come for a year, and they might understand a little bit more. But if it's a language that they're just learning, that's also still not, they're only going to get so far. But they might notice things that people who live inside that world necessarily hadn't really thought about. You might think to ask questions that other people didn't think about. So there's this idea that, just the phrase Mr. Inside and Mr. Outside came to me, and I was like, where did that come from? So I looked it up, and there were a couple of football players, and for the Army team back in the 40s, I guess one who was like a fullback or something like that, and the other one was probably a receiver or something. I don't remember. But just this idea that there's different roles to play, and they each have their valid perspectives. So I deal with music all the time, and so there's also an anthropology of music that's part of the intellectual history of my field, and we're talking. But ultimately, I like to think of it as if ethnography is writing about people, then ethnomusicology is the study of people making music. So the people are always in there. It's not just about the music, it's also about the people. Another stream of the intellectual history from about 100 years ago, when people were first starting to make field recordings. The first field recordings were actually made in the 1880s, not that long after the phonograph was invented, of some Native American music. And so people were already starting to collect music and trying to compare music of different cultures and try to think, well, what does this mean about what it is to be human, you know? What it is that we all have in common. So some frameworks were developed for universal comparison, and I'm going to talk about one of those now, which is how to classify musical instruments, or how we do it in my field. And so there's this idea of the strange to familiar translation. You know, if you create this, you have a category and you find the familiar instrument, like a rubboard fits into this category, then you look for other instruments in other parts of the world that fit that same category, and then it starts giving you ideas about, well, where did that maybe come from, or where else is that kind of instrument prevalent? And the other handy thing about having these types of classifications is that the names vary from one place to another. So you might be able to think of various types of instruments. Certainly when you have lots of different people in a close proximity that speak different languages, then you're going to have different names for the same instrument, because the musical ideas are going to transfer across those cultures maybe more easily without the language having to be the same. So like a thumb piano, which is all these different metal tongues that you can play with your thumbs that you may have seen from Africa. That has many different names in Africa, but we just call it a thumb piano in English. But there's a classification for that. So the ones that we sort of use worldwide, we classify instruments primarily by what vibrates first. When you go to play an instrument, what starts vibrating, and then that there might be resonators that then amplify that, but nonetheless, there's something that starts vibrating first, because that's what music is those vibrations in the air that reach you as sound. And so we have sort of four main ones, with the electrophones getting added because, of course, now we have a lot of electrified instruments. So the air could start vibrating first. You might have a string. You might have a membrane, that's mostly talking about drums. The kazoos also fit in that category. And then the idiophones is like the body of the instruments is the thing that vibrates first, like castanets or a triangle or a rubboard. And electrophones would be something like a loudspeaker, Hammond B3 organ. I just gave away the answers to one of my quiz questions later. I'm going to have little quizzes here along the way just to see if you understand what was going on. Not to turn in, but yeah, for extra credit. That's right. So just to go through the four categories really quickly, the membranophones. You get this membrane. It's usually a drum head that's stretched across a frame of some kind. And then within those, there's subcategories by shape, the shape of the body of the drum. And you can see vessel drums, frame drums like a tambourine, footed drums, goblet drums, etc. Now, idiophones, the way that they're categorized underneath that is like how are they played? You know, do you hit them? That would be stamping, for example. You can shake them, you can hit them. You have two halves of something. You can concuss them together. You can scrape them like the rubboard, and so on. You can also even pluck them, like I just mentioned with the thumb piano. And so there are the main families of idiophones there. Rattles are good ones. Struck bells. We'll talk more about some of those later. So I talked about discoveries by classification. So if you consider how would you classify a rubboard? Well, it's a scraped idiophone. It's the thing of itself that vibrates. You scrape it, it makes sounds. We look at other examples of this. Early one might have been a jawbone with teeth in it that you could scrape with a stick. Or you could make notches in a bone and scrape that. And then you may be familiar with the guiro, which is an instrument you find in the Caribbean and in Latin music in Cuba, Puerto Rico. And then, of course, we have our washboard. And then the frottoir, the one with the shoulder straps that Clifton Chenier thought up and was made by, I think it was the Father T. Don, is that it? Or a relative of T. Don, of Z, key of Z rubboards. In aerophone principles, it's the reed. Is the next thing that we talk about. You know, you've started a column of air vibrating as what is the reed? What creates the turbulence in the air that creates that vibration? If it could be a flat edge like a flute, a single reed that's vibrating that you blow across like a clarinet, double reed like an oboe, a mouthpiece where you buzz your lips like a trumpet. And I'll talk more about this harmonic series later that has to do with timbre. All right, discoveries by classification, accordion. So the accordion we classify as an aerophone because you're taking the air and with the bellows, you're using the bellows to push the air through the reed, and then the reed starts vibrating. And those little reeds are called free reeds because they're just like a metal plate with a notch in it that allows that metal tongue within the metal plate to move back and forth when you push air through it hard enough. And so this idea the free reed was invented in Asia, East Asia. So this instrument that's Sheng from China. I believe that Junior Martin has one of these in his display case in his shop for when buses of tourists come in and they visit his accordion making shop in Scott, and they have a little presentation that his family does, and they start with one of these instruments to show that this reed came from somewhere else. And so there's a little picture of the reed block that shows how when you're pushing in on the accordion, there's one set of flaps that opens, and then when you pull it, the air goes in the other direction, and then the other reed gets activated. So you have two sets of reeds for whether you're going in and out, and it depends on the kind of accordion, whether there's the same note going in and out or a different note going in and out. So these are the melodeon and the concertina. These were some of the two of the first ones that were invented in Europe using this free reed principle. And of course also the harmonica, the mouth organ. And then the piano accordion comes later, so that's the chromatic one. So I mentioned the chromatic ones are the ones where no matter whether you're going in and out, you're playing the same note on the same key. When we talk about accordions, that's what we mean by chromatic. And then, of course, you may have seen a harmonium too. Some of these are large, like a reed organ almost, using a full keyboard where you're sitting down. But there's more. This is where the creativity, so this is like variations on a theme, I would call it. You take one idea and say, I got this free reed, what else, well, how could I build an instrument with this? It's pretty light, it's got certain advantages, it can be pretty loud. So these chromatic accordions, just the accordions alone come in like an amazing number of options. So this is a 5-row chromatic button accordion that's shown being played by Bojac here. And there are a few players in Cajun and zydeco music that use this, not too many. It is pretty complicated, but it can play any note that you want to play. Here's a interesting one I saw in the Boston Museum of Fine Art a few months ago, sort of an example of an instrument that you blow into that has kind of like keys like a trumpet, but they're just activating the free reeds, and the keys of the keys in the trumpet are sort of arranged like a piano keyboard. A more modern version of that would be something called the melodica, which is kind of a kid's instrument you may have seen. I did see one video of Clifton Chenier playing this at a show, just for like one song as a novelty. I'm sorry, which ones? Professional musicians playing melodica. So not just for kids anymore. Chordophones. So here with string instruments, what we look for is how are the strings related to the body of the instrument, and does the instrument have a neck, or are the strings strung all along the body? So if you see I don't really have a pointer here. Can you see my little? Nope, you can't see my cursor. So if you look up at the top row there, letter A, musical bow. It's a very simple idea. B is called a lyre, which we don't see much anymore except in traditional music in Africa, but the idea of having the cross piece. C would be a harp. D, we call it a lute, but the guitar, sort of the guitar family, you could think of it that way. And then E is the last one, would be a zither, which is just like the board with the string strung across it. So visual quiz, string instruments, why are all of these classified the same? You might not have thought of all of these as belonging to the same family. But if you think about it a minute, if you ever looked inside a piano, it kind of looks not that different from that auto harp, right? It's got the board, and it's got the strings that are strung all along it. And sort of the steel guitar is kind of this, basically the same idea. It was inspired by a guitar which started from a different place altogether, but you still basically got a flat surface with the strings strung all along it. So when you think about it that way, then it's kind of opens up new possibilities, maybe. So, and then for keyboard, so sometimes we think, when I was a kid, and go on a field trip to the symphony, and the director talks about, well, there's 3 kinds of instruments in symphony. There's the winds, the strings, and the percussion. That was it. Oh, and then we have the keyboard instrument. You might think of keyboards as a separate category. Or the piano might have been called a percussion instrument because there's the hammers that hit the strings. But if you think about each one of these types of instruments, what vibrates first? They're not all the same, right? It's just because the interface to the human being is the same. They all require you to play a keyboard, but how it makes the sound is quite different, and the quality of the sound is quite different as it comes out. So we mentioned that the piano is the accordion is the aerophone, and of course the piano has strings. The celeste has like metal bars that get hit, and then the Hammond B3 organ is a completely electromechanical instrument. So, variations on a theme, I just want to go back to that. So now what I started talking about is approaches to thinking about how to make a musical instrument, how to design a musical instrument, what different approaches could we take. So we start with a musical bow, which is pretty basic. We might want to put a little resonator on that bow so it can make a little more sound. But hey, what if we put a bunch of bows together and connected them to one resonator, and then I could have lots of different strings to play at the same time. So, and we're going to put a skin over the top of that resonator to enclose it. We could take that same resonator then, instead of having those bows to maintain tensions on the strings, why don't we just use a crossbar? So now we have a lyre. When we still have our resonator with the skin over the top. So these are all from Africa. And then we could also, instead of having that cross piece, we could just have the one stick kind of at an angle and have the strings in tension across that. We still have that resonator with the skin hole over the top. Now I couldn't find the zither with the skin covered resonator, but there's a couple of variations on what we call a trough zither, where so the resonator has an open top, and it's just kind of a bowl. And then there's another way to keep the strings free so that they can vibrate, and is to have you have bridges. So there's an example of that. And then, if you can stretch strings across a board, you could also stretch strings across another flat surface, even if it was curved like a tube. So this is an example of a tube zither where the strings are stretched along the length of the tube, and you hold it and play it. This one's played with the fingernails, apparently. So lots of ways to skin a cat, as the expression goes. And then, of course, we could just use we have the neck. I would use the resonator, put a stick on the end, that becomes the neck, and then you have a lute. So this is an example of a fiddle with a bow from Africa, and then, of course, one that you would pluck. So it's not hard to see where the banjo comes from when you look at it like that. And this is something that's been talked a lot about lately in scholarship, and also in bluegrass circles and old-time music circles, that developing a greater recognition of the African origins of the banjo. And here's an example of an instrument where it kind of combines these categories. So you might start with a resonator, put a stick on the end, but then instead of just stretching the strings straight down the stick or straight down the neck, you're going to have a sort of an extended bridge, and this becomes sort of more of a harp, because you've got these strings at an angle. And so this is a kora from Africa, and just to inject a little music into the situation, I thought I was going to play some. Maybe just back up here a little bit. So we're going to have some sound here. Let's see. So I don't know if you could hear the kora very well on that in the mix, but that was Cedric Watson's song Afro Zydeco, and he invited a kora player who was living in New Orleans at the time to come and join him on that number. So I thought that was kind of a fun meeting of the worlds there. So of course, once you have these instruments in different cultures, then you can also combine them in different ways. This symposium and the exhibit is more about the makers than it is about playing the instruments, so I'm not going to talk too much about the playing of them, but that's obviously a huge topic. Now, I'm going to show you visually one version of the story of the evolution of the guitar, starting with a lyre in ancient Greece called the kitara. I'm not sure how you say that in Greek, but that's how I'm going to say it. And if you start with that instrument, you can say, well, if I put a neck along those strings, kind of bring those strings just a little closer together and put a neck on those things, then I can actually use that as a fingerboard, and I can start to make different notes with those strings. But you notice they still have the crossbar and the struts. So that's sort of like a middle stage on the way to an instrument like that. So once you make that neck strong enough, then you don't need that other piece with the crossbar anymore. And so this vihuela, which is often cited as a precursor to the guitar. Here's an early European guitar, late 1600s. Has more of that curvature to it. So this another approach to the instrument is like, well, what if I use some kind of materials that you wouldn't necessarily expect, or lots of different physical materials can make different kinds of sounds, and so we might not be used to having instruments that use water, but there's such a thing as a water drum, and there's several examples of this in traditional Native American music, of using water drums. There's also an example of just using a surface of water as a percussion instrument that a field recording from Africa that I used to show some other principles of African music, where these girls are they're wading like waist deep in some water, and they're just using the water itself as the drum, and then singing along with it. What about rock? Let's use some rocks. You ever thought about using rocks to make your musical instrument? Okay, you could think, I've got two rocks, I hit them together, it makes a sound. I could do that. But how about taking a whole bunch of rocks and working with them to make different notes and hanging them on a stand, and now you can play a whole song with the rocks. So this is an instrument from China. Another thing to think about is that if you classify instruments differently, then that might give you a new way to think about it. So the Chinese system for classifying instruments is by the material in which they're made of. So if they're made of stone, or if they're made of wood, if they're made of metal, then those are the classifications of the instruments that they use in China. Another creative approach to this I call insert part A into instrument B. So if you're trying to think outside the box and say, well, I've got this thing that I use for this instrument over here, what if I used it with that other instrument over there? Well, that might be weird. Ever thought like horsehair we use for the bow and for a violin, but what about just put a hole in the middle of your drum and draw the horsehair through back and forth and see what kind of a sound that makes. So there's a friction drum, it's called, and horsehair is one of the things that you can use to make that sound. It kind of makes an ee sound. I can't really do that very well. My falsetto isn't good enough. You can also use a string. You can also use a stick. There's one in Brazilian music that's used in samba that you might have seen before. Or there were lots of experiments with the guitar. This was a harp guitar. It's like, let's take the guitar and put some harp strings on it too. That way we have two instruments in one. It's a sort of similar idea to the kora, but somewhat different too. How about your harmonica? How about does your harmonica need some bells on it? What kinds of ideas like that? Next. Oh, yes. So this is a snare drum. This is where some of Jesse Del Gisi's research is coming in. So this is apparently a favorite snare drum in Zydeco music. And it's not just favored just because of its sound, but also because they modify the sound. So drummers like Brad Frank, who plays for his brother Keith, like to tighten those skins really tight, and get a really high sound in it, really high, really loud sound in that snare drum. But the lug nuts that the manufacturer uses with this model wear out if you keep tightening the skin that tight. So Brad he's customized the drum. He puts other lug nuts on there so he can crank the skin even tighter, and then they hold up. And if you're wondering who Joey Jordison is, there's a photo. So he doesn't play Zydeco music, I can tell you that. He was in a heavy metal band called Slipknot for a long time. And then on our exhibit, there's a couple of instruments that I really like a lot by Warner Schexnayder. So, and I'm going to sort of put that in this category, which is the arch top. So all fiddles have arch tops, and violins have arch tops. And so this is one of his violins that he made with the lamination on the ribs. Really attractive instrument. Does not have strings on it right now, but he thought, hey, if I can make an arch top for the fiddle, what would it be like if we had a guitar with an arch top? So then he made a guitar with an arch. It was just gorgeous. So this is over at the museum right now. I'd love to hear what that sounds like, but that had to take a long time to make. Another principle: make it louder. I want to hear you. Put some horns on that harmonica so we can like amplify the sound. And as if it didn't need it, the accordion, maybe let's put one on the accordion too. You're probably familiar with a resonator guitar, like a National Steel or a dobro. That was sort of a way to amplify the guitar before electrical amplification came along. Around that time, there was also the need for instruments to be louder for early recording. Before the electric microphone was invented, you just like sang into the bell of the phonograph recorder. So they tried inventing other things to make the instruments louder. So this is this is a Hawaiian guitar that they tried to make louder using that sort of tuba bell. This is at the Experience Music Project in Seattle. Another instrument there they have is like the first model of the electric guitar, made by Rickenbacker in the early 30s, which was affectionately known as the frying pan, apparently. Then there's also, surprisingly, sometimes you want to make the instrument softer. So also at the Boston Museum of Fine Arts was this thing called the practice violin, which was designed, I guess, so if you lived in an apartment where you didn't want your neighbors banging on the wall telling you to shut up, then you could just you could practice very quietly, and no one needed to hear you. And I was struck then at the exhibit when I saw this skeleton fiddle by Milton Vanacore. It was a very similar shape. I asked Chris Segura if there were inputs on that fiddle as an electric fiddle. He said it looks like there might have been some places that are not immediately obvious right now. So I can imagine also that for an electric fiddle, you would want that. There's certain advantages to not having the instrument itself be that resonant. If you want to control all the sound through the electronics. Another principle, and we've talked about this some already this morning, even before getting started, is the principle of don't recycle, reuse. Right? So if you got stuff lying around the house you're not using anymore, make a musical instrument out of it. In Trinidad, they had these oil drums, the oil barrels, that they very cleverly turned into drums that they could use, and they figured out how to tune them so they could play like a whole scale on one drum. And they make them in different sizes, and so that's a whole thing now, of course. And they make them especially as instruments and not just recycling the drums. And that's kind of happened here in Louisiana too, where they started out recycling things and then kind of upped their game, especially with the accordion makers. So the idea of a cardboard fiddle was not invented here. There's plenty of oral history about cigar box fiddles that various players made, like Conrad Fontenot and Bebe Carrière. But this is one from South Africa, and there's the one on exhibit that Bebe Carrière made. And then, of course, the one that was mentioned earlier by Milton Vanacore using the tobacco tin, just a stick. So I'm not sure whether you would call that a zither, a stick zither, or a lute, but anyway, doesn't matter what you call it. It's kind of cool. And there's also a photo in the exhibit of Mr. Milton playing the instrument. This next design principle I took from my software engineering days. So this is from computer programmers who would say, why make something simple and elegant when you can make it complex and wonderful? So I think of Microsoft Word as an example of that. It's a program that does many different things. And I've used it for 25 years, and I use it every day, and it's great. But it's not simple. There's lots of different stuff that you can do with it, and every time they change it, you have to find where they put stuff, and it's kind of confusing, but when you know how to use it, there's a lot of stuff you can do. This is a sarod from India. It has not only strings that you play like a guitar where you can put your fingers down and change the notes. It also has drone strings that are sort of off the fingerboard that you would play, where you would pluck, but you don't change the note. And then it also has sympathetic strings that you don't touch at all, but they vibrate in sympathy with the notes that you're playing. So you have a sympathetic string, you can think of it, if you have a sympathetic string for every note that you might play, and when you play that note, the sympathetic string vibrates along with it, and maybe some of the other ones that they enter in the Harmonic Series as well. And this changes the timbre of the instrument, this changes how it sounds. It kind of gives it more of a presence, a warmth. So as you might imagine, some of these instruments are complicated not only and how to play them, but also how to maintain them. So you can imagine how long it would take to tune that thing. The uilleann pipes from Ireland are another one where they have like 3 different kinds of pipes. There's the drone pipes, the pipes that you play with the chanter, and then there's some like chord pipes too. I can't think of they sort of sound like a car horn. There's some excellent YouTube videos demonstrating the uilleann pipes that I like to play for my students. Also a very difficult instrument to maintain. I knew one guy who was learning how to play it, and he gave up because he didn't want to be also the instrument repairman, his own instrument repairman. So if you have one harmonica, why not just put a bunch on a rotation thing? This is kind of Randy Falcone's idea for the accordion, kicked up about 4 more notches. You can play 6 different keys with this thing. This is you may not be able to see that well, but those are the insides of a Hammond B3 organ and all the connections it takes. Every note, I think, has 9 different rotating wheels that create the different magnetic fields that play the different harmonic partials of each note that you play, and they can be changed. It's very complicated, but it sounds really cool. And then also at the exhibit is this is not a picture from the exhibit, but Mr. Milton Gilbo, underneath one of his pedal steel guitar, he put a mirror so that you can see up underneath it. And if you haven't checked that out, I recommend it. But this is a picture of, in the lower right here, of a pedal steel guitar turned upside down so that you can see all of the mechanical relays underneath. You can see those are all knee levers, so that the player operates all of those with his knees to change the tunings of various strings to make different chord qualities. And what you can't see is you can see those metal rods going up. The foot pedals are on the other end of those. So they have foot pedals as well. So they have the foot pedals, they have the knee levers, and they have, of course, what they're doing with their hands. Okay, now I want to switch gears a little bit to talk about the quality of the sound. I think I'm going to see how I'm doing on time here. Yeah, I think I just need to move on. I think I'm going to skip the video. So with timbre, the idea is that every note that you might hear in music, or just about every note, like if I just sing a note like E, sounds like one note, right? But there's actually lots of different notes going part of that. It's part of what we call the harmonic series, and that gives it that particular sound. And different parts of those notes but you can't hear them as separate. They're fused together in your brain. So this is something that your brain does is it takes all those sounds and it kind of turns them into one thing, which is really handy when you're in the woods and you hear a sound, and it could be a bear or a tiger, and you need to know that for your own survival. So there are evolutionary reasons why our brains do this type of thing to sounds that reduces them into sources that we can recognize and identify. So if I sing E, those different parcels have different strengths. And if I sing ooh, that's a different sound, right? Same note, different sound. Oh. So that's what makes each voice or sound distinctive. And when you hear my voice and you hear somebody else's voice, if you hear Mr. Larry Miller come from Kentucky, you say, Mark's not there anymore. I can even tell that just by the sound of his voice. That's somebody else. And if you know Mr. Larry, you say, oh yeah, that's Mr. Larry. Because his voice doesn't sound like anybody else's either, right? We all have a distinct sound of voice, so that's timbre. So it's not just that harmonic series, but it's also the noisy parts too. So, and the noisy parts really come in with percussion instruments because they don't necessarily, like a T-fire, doesn't necessarily play a note that you could sing back. It's a little less defined. Or you can think of a snare drum. If you hit a snare drum, it makes a sound, but it's not like a note, not like a pitch you could play on a piano. So these timbre also identifies an instrument, and maybe it makes a T-fire sound different from another type of triangle. So I'm going to play 5 different triangles, and I'm going to let you guess which ones are the T-fires and which ones are other kinds of triangles. How's that? Louder. It's triangle 2. Triangle number 3. Triangle number 4. Triangle number 5. Or do you have your answers sort of formulated in your mind as to which ones are the T-fires and which ones aren't? So I'm just going to go through them really quick. So the first one was a T-fire. that was just in the KRVS studio where I made this recording. That Carl Fontenot gave me when he saw what I was doing with this project. The second one was one that I bought at the Jean Lafitte Center in Eunice, my first trip to Louisiana in '94. I don't know who made it. Apologies to the makers here because I don't know who the makers are. Triangle 3 was one I brought in Grogueto after I moved here. You can see it the sustain doesn't last as long. Triangle 4 is a concert triangle owned by one of our assistant band director, Mr. Brett Landry. And Triangle 5, which had by far the longest sustain on it, another concert triangle, signature by another famous concert percussionist, Neal Grover. That had quite a sound to it. Now if you look at these all together, you can kind of see that, yeah, they didn't all sound the same, and it's reflected in these spectrograms. So what these spectrograms are showing is those are harmonic partials. You know, I remember I talked about how each sound has actually multiple parts to it, different frequency levels, and that's what these spectrograms show. And the strength of the partial, like how loud each partial is shown by the color. So the hotter color, like a violet or a blue, is going along the spectrum, Roy G. Biv. So the ones on the higher part of the spectrum, blue, indigo, violet, those are the stronger partials. And you can see that some of the partials don't all last an equal period of time. So that gives an instrument also a sound too, is how it decays over time. And if we were going to look at this more closely, we could look at each one of those partials and see how they relate to each other. But my wife told me to not get too nerdy, so I'll just keep going. And then what do these diagrams look like when you actually start using them with real music? So this is one step closer to real music. Is if I play the triangle with a waltz pattern, ka-chunk, ka-ding-a-ring, ka-chunk-a-ring, like that, then it starts to look like that. So that maybe that's similar partial structure, but it starts to maybe behave a little differently when you're actually playing music. So it's important to always remember when you're doing these more nerdy things that the ultimate goal is to still understand music and not just scientific measurements of individual sounds. What Jesse's working on for his master's thesis is looking at the sound of Zydeco music and how it's changed over time, looking at the entire musical texture. So he's taken live recordings of these various bands because we've been talking about the importance of looking at live sound as opposed to studio recorded sound. So those are kind of two different projects. It's a master's thesis, it's not a dissertation, so we're going to focus on live sound. And to do that, he's really, and especially focusing on the snare drum and the kick drum and how that's changed. And so he's sort of identified where you can see those labels in the mix there, the snare overtones, how loud the kick drum is, where it is in the spectrum from low to high. That's Bouzou. And if you compare that to Beaujacq, that looks a lot different. You can see a lot more energy in the low end of things. The low end is starting to get more active, but the snare drum is still relatively weak, or it's there, but it's not as prominent as when you look at a Keith Frank recording, Keith Frank performance, where the bass is even even more prominent because they're miking the kick drum, and as well as those really low, all those lights really down low in the diagram are the amplified kick drum more than the bass guitar really. But there's also like more overtones to the snare drum because, as I mentioned, Brad Frank is really cranking that skin really tight and hitting it in a certain way with a flam stroke. So these are the types of things you can look at, and we like to think about the study of musical instruments is also how they're used and how they're filtered through the sound system. We haven't really talked about, we could also talk about how accordions are mic'd. Some of them have internal microphones that has a really different sound than if you put the microphone on the outside. So there's all kinds of things we could talk about that affect the instruments and how they sound. That's, you know, arguably really part of the instrument, or certainly how it's used in a particular style of music. But that's about all I have for today. So if we have time for questions, I'm happy to take some now, or I can take some later. I'll leave that up to whoever's next. Yeah.
Can you go back to the slide?
Sure. What's the snare overtones? Well, the snare has its own overtone series too, right? Even if it's in harmonic, they're in harmonic partials, but they're still partials. So it's interesting when he cranks the skin that tight, there's more energy in the higher partials of that snare drum sound that actually show up on the diagram, whereas in the previous diagrams it wasn't loud enough to show up. Does that make sense? I'm sorry. That's my understanding. Is that what you would say, Jesse? Yeah. Any other questions? Michael, how are we doing? Is it time to stop?
I have a question over here.
Another question. We have a microphone coming for the questioner. Here you go, ma'am.
What is the difference between a Cajun accordion and a Zydeco accordion?
The Cajun accordion and a Zydeco accordion, in terms of the instrument itself, they can use the same one. It depends on what they want. So some Zydeco players use the single roll melodeon. Now they might choose to have it in a different key, so they can get different reeds put in it to put it in a lower key. Some Zydeco players like that. For a while, there was a thing where the Zydeco players kind of made their own statement by having it in B flat instead of C or D. So C or D were the common Cajun keys, and they had a B flat. So Zydeco Force had a song called "My B Flat." It was kind of a tongue-in-cheek tribute to that trend. But now there's even more keys that some of the Zydeco players use. Also, Zydeco players will use a triple note accordion, which has more notes to it than the single row. You don't see Cajun players using that very much, or the piano accordion, which is what Clifton Chenier preferred. So with the Zydeco, there's more variety of accordions that they generally use than with Cajun music. Although, Steve Riley has a new accordion that he's commissioned that's none of the above, that can play more notes, but it's not a standard triple row. It's got its own kind of special layout. Yeah, it's kind of chromatic, or it can play all the notes. I'm not sure if it's like chromatic in the sense that the same notes going in and out, but yeah. Any other questions? Do we have time for a video clip or no? 5? Carissa, could you help me with that? So, going back to the principle of make it loud, I have a clip from Africa from a Bela Fleck documentary called "Throw Down Your Heart," where he took the idea was he took the banjo back to Africa, and he was looking for a bunch of traditional musicians to jam with. And so he goes to this one village in Uganda, and they're playing a marimba, but it's not a marimba on a stand with like tube resonators that you might see, but it's a trough resonator, you might think of like a bowl, but instead of making a bowl and putting it underneath the wooden keys of the marimba, they dig a hole in the ground. That's probably the size of a car. And they make these huge keys and they put on top of it. So that's what you're going to see if we can get the video up. I've heard of these things done with string instruments too, where they dig a hole in the ground and use it as a zither, use the ground as a zither. And there's also the diddley bow. Okay, we're going to try one more time. You may have heard the diddley bow, which is a one-string instrument that was used in Mississippi, and it might have been stretched along a stick, but they also would sometimes stretch it like against the side of a house, and you just use the house as the sort of the thing that they stretch the string against. And if it doesn't work, we tried. But I hardly, if it doesn't work, I will recommend Throw Down Your Heart as a something to see if you can rent on Netflix or see some other kind of way, because it's one of the best films that features traditional music of any kind I've seen in a long time. Throw Down Your Heart. And the name of that phrase comes from a scene in the film from Tanzania where they're visiting a place where people were taken away on slave ships. So the idea was, if you got captured and you knew you were going to end up on one of these ships, you had to, just leave your heart here, because you were done. No? Okay. So we're gonna pull the plug on the video for today, but I will leave you with that. If there are no other questions, I want to thank you much for your attention.